I was in my first year of sciences at UBC. My friend was in his first year of engineering. And we were sitting in the car one day on our commute home. We were carpooling together, and we got talking about faith, about church, about God. He had been a churchgoer for most of his life, most of his childhood, but as he got older, he simply grew out of it, he said. And now as a young adult and as a university student, he just could not reconcile the Bible with the world that he knew around him. His main problem with the Bible, he said, obviously God did not create the world in 6 days. I mean, that's plain to see. How can we believe that? How can we believe that the Bible is reliable and trustworthy when it teaches that? And it was a genuine stumbling block for him. He couldn't see past this 7-day or 6-day literal understanding of the creation story. And the fact that as he looked around at the world around him using scientific eyes, that the world was actually much, much older. And I really had no answers for him. Even though my faith was growing in that first year of university, I really had no response to him at that time. I don't remember how that conversation finished exactly, but I remember carrying that question with me throughout my undergraduate years, trying to reconcile faith and science, and in particular, evolution and creation. I'll tell you another story. In my second year, physical chemistry class, one day the professor was lecturing about the second law of thermodynamics, simply stating that the universe was moving towards this state of disorder and chaos. The universe is constantly expanding and cooling. This is just a fact of physics, a fact of the universe that has been actually measured. And then I remember listening to a podcast. Well, actually, they didn't have podcasts back then. It's a radio show, Bible Answer Man it was. And the speaker was talking about evolution and why evolution must be false. It cannot be scientifically feasible because it contravenes the second law of thermodynamics. Because if the universe is going towards decay and coolness and disorder, then how could it be that life evolved spontaneously, naturally on this earth? So, armed with that piece of knowledge, after my physical chemistry class one day, as a bright-eyed 18-year-old, second-year biochem student, I approached my respectable older professor in his 50s after class, and I said, I have a question for you, professor, about this law of entropy that we've been learning. In biology, we've been learning about evolution, but the law of entropy says that we're moving towards disorder and chaos, and eventually all things will just lose all energy in this universe. How is it possible that life on Earth evolved from single-celled organisms to complex life if this law of thermodynamics is true? And I was fully expecting my professor to look at me with wide eyes and say, wow, you are brilliant, Sam. That's a wonderful observation. Instead, he responded to me without even pausing, saying, well, although the law of entropy applies universally, you can think of the Earth as a kind of a local, small anomaly to that, a temporary kind of anomaly that will, in the long run, prove the law of thermodynamics to be true. And I said, oh, okay, I see. And not wanting to display my absolute dumbfoundedness and not knowing how to respond, being completely deflated that my argument was dismissed so easily. So that problem of evolution and creation stayed with me, in fact, till my first year at Regent College. Even though my faith continued to grow in university, that question that I wrestled with continued with me until Regent College, until I started studying the Bible at a master's level. It wasn't then that I began to make more sense of these early chapters of Genesis. That is partly what I want to talk about today, because I think that that can be a stumbling block for some in the faith, as it was for my engineering friend in that first year of university. Especially if you've grown up learning some things in church, and then you start going to college or university, and you learn opposing ideas that you've not been exposed to. How do you reconcile these different ideas, these different worldviews and understandings? Okay, so here's my outline. Here's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to talk first about how to read Genesis 1 to 11 well. How do we read Genesis 1 to 11 well? This first part of the Bible. Second, I want to pick out two key themes from these passages, from this text, chapters 1 to 11, that some of you have studied in GCC this past week. Two key themes, and continue to think about these themes. And then finally, I want to talk about the relevance of those themes for us today. Okay? That's my general outline. So let's begin by talking about Genesis 1 to 11. And first, I want to talk about this notion of genre. Genre. This section of the Bible is often called the primeval history by scholars, the primeval history. And as I mentioned last week, the Bible is made up of lots of different kinds of literatures. We call those genres. To read the Bible well, you have to know what kind of genre you're reading when you're in that part of the Bible. It's like the difference between reading a newspaper versus reading a novel. Or maybe the difference between reading a chemistry textbook and reading a comic book. Right? There are different kinds of literature, different kinds of genres. So if you go to school reading a textbook like you do a comic book, it's not going to be very helpful for you. Or if you go and read a novel the way you read a newspaper, it's not going to be very enjoyable for you. We have to respect the genre of the piece of literature, the section of the Bible that we're reading. And the part of the Bible that we're studying, Genesis 1 to 11, is quite challenging because it's unique in terms of its genre, in terms of its kind of categorization in the Bible. There is nothing quite like it in all the rest of the Bible. In fact, it's really quite different from chapters 12 to 50, the rest of Genesis. And here's a comparison of just a few of these differences. So in terms of the time span, chapters 1 to 11 covers 2,000 years, approximately, if we count up all of the years and add them up and think that there are no gaps in between them. From Adam to Noah, there are 10 generations, and then from Noah to Abraham, there are 10 generations. Altogether 20 generations. It spans about 2,000 years, counting up all the years. In contrast, chapters 12 through to 50 covers just 4 generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So about 300 years or less. So the time span is vastly different between 1 to 11 and 12 to 50. Second of all, geography. 1 to 11 is global in its scope, right? It's creation of the world, this worldwide global flood, spreading of all nations from Babel eastwards. 12 to 50, on the other hand, takes place primarily in Canaan, the land of Canaan, which is today mostly Palestine and Israel, and Egypt, some parts of Egypt. And there's some very specific locations, names of the cities that are mentioned, like Bethel and Shechem and Hebron. Today we know where those cities and towns are. Locations that are very specific. So geography is very different between these two. Third, the development of characters is very different between 1 to 11 and 12 to 50. So 1 to 11 has a very kind of limited description of the development of the characters, the figures in these chapters of the Bible. Adam, Eve, even Noah, which is the longest story in this section of the Bible. Really, the focus isn't so much on Noah as much as it is on God and his actions. But 12 to 50, we have these detailed descriptions of the lives of the patriarchs and their families. We see them responding to God. We see them making decisions. We see them resisting God. We see them wrestling with God, surrendering to God, trusting in God. These differences in how people are responding and the development of the characters in these different parts of the Bible. And then the final one I'll bring to your attention is the length, the sheer length. So 1 to 11, I said, covers thousands of years in just 11 chapters. 12 to 50, that's 39 chapters, just over 3 generations. If you were to ask, without knowing the content of the book of Genesis, where is the weight? Where is the center of gravity of Genesis? Would it be in the second part or the first part? Probably the second part. The author focuses mostly on this development of the nation of Israel through Abraham. So just the sheer length of these parts of Genesis tell us that they're quite different from each other. So back to this question of a genre. What genre is the Bible? What genre, I should say, is Genesis 1 to 11? I think the best description of its genre, these chapters, is one of an ancient origins account. It is one of an ancient origins account. See, there were other accounts of ancient origins in the ancient world, in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. So there were other accounts, and I've listed just a few of those there for you, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Enuma Elish, or the Atrahasis Epic, and not to mention other Egyptian origins accounts. Genesis 1 to 11, when we read them in the context of the ancient world, what we see is that actually it's a Hebrew ancient origins account. So in lots of ways, it's similar to these other ancient origins accounts, which predate Genesis by hundreds of years at least. So for example, the creation of the sun, moon, and stars for keeping the days and the years and the seasons, just like in Genesis 1. The creation of human beings after the creation of animals. There's also stories of universal global floods, even a rainbow after these floods, appearing after the flood. These are some of the common elements of these different Mesopotamian ancient origins stories. So what it seems is happening is that the biblical authors borrowed some of these elements of the ancient origins accounts of the world around them, the cultures around them, and adapted it for their purposes as the Holy Spirit was inspiring them to write Scripture. What I mean by adapted it for their purposes is because there are these contrasts too. These are some of the similarities I mentioned, but there are these vast, stark contrasts between the creation account in Bible versus some of these creation accounts in the world around them. For example, the gods of the ancient world of Babylon were many. There was many of them, and on one account, they were constantly battling, fighting with each other, and then creation is a part of that battle. In another account, they create humankind in order to do their work for them because they didn't want to do the work on the earth anymore. Right? This is not the biblical creation account at all. In the biblical creation account, there's one God who's supreme. He speaks, and simply the world comes into being. There's no one who contests him. There's no one battling against him. He is one sovereign God above all else. And he doesn't create humankind to serve him as slaves so that he doesn't have to labor. We learned that last week. He's created human beings as a climax of his creation to be his representatives on the earth. Totally different understanding of the universe, of God, of human beings, and our role within this universe. Is God at work in the act of creation? Absolutely. Absolutely. Did he necessarily create it over 7 24-hour periods, as we might think about it scientifically as we read the account today? Is that the intention of Genesis 1 and 2? Not necessarily. He could just as well have created the world through evolution. If we understand that God's power is almighty and he's sustaining the universe by his very will, and he's working through evolution. Even though he may not be visible, even though he may not be present at every moment redirecting it, he's present at every moment, willing it towards his purpose. I think that general approach makes more sense of the data that we have, both biblically as well as scientifically and historically and archaeologically. That makes most sense of the data, I believe. If I could go back in time and speak to my engineer friend about the 7 days of creation or the 6 days of creation, I would tell him that there's actually no conflict between science and faith. There's no conflict between creation and evolution, not necessarily. It is a false dichotomy. It's a misunderstanding both of what the Bible is as well as of what science is. Now, this area of evolution and faith in creation and science, it's a huge topic. And we only have time just to gloss the surface of it. And if you want, I can refer you to other resources, or you can take a course on it at Regent College like I did, an entire 13-week course. Maybe we'll do one here, GCC, some version of it. But here we just have time to touch upon this topic briefly. But what I want to claim is that God is bigger than any individual mechanism of creation, whether that's a 24-day literal 7-day, 24-hour period, 6 days, or whether it is through evolution and over spans of hundreds of millions or billions of years. God is bigger than any one theory of creation. He is the one definitely doing all of it. Okay, I'm going to tell you a joke just to lighten the mood a little bit. I sense some gears grinding, and people maybe will be a little bit upset with me from some of the things that I've said. But I'll tell you a joke. I remember hearing a funny story once. It illustrates the kind of invisibility of God at work. So a man comes home from work, and he just plops himself down on the couch, puts his feet up, and starts watching television. His wife storms into the room and says, "I can't do this anymore. How can you do that? I come home from work, I've been cooking and cleaning, I've been cleaning up the house, and you just sit on the couch making a mess, and you're not doing anything." Well, the man has compassion, looks at his wife, looks at her really seriously, and then he has a thought. He says, "Honey, don't worry. Let me show you something. I want to show you something. Don't worry about the mess and everything." So he brings her to the laundry room. And in all seriousness, he says, "See this laundry basket that's on the counter? I didn't want to tell you this, but it's actually a magic laundry basket. Every night I throw my clothes into it. I toss everything I want into it. And every morning I wake up and the clothes are clean, it's folded, it's on my bed. And I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to jinx it, but ever since we got married and since we moved in, this is the magic laundry basket." And the wife just looks at him completely dumbfounded, and she didn't know what to say. And she's about to turn away, and she says, wait, I have more. And I'll bring you to the living room, I'll show you something. So he says, "See this table? This is a magic table. No matter what I do on it, I put stuff on it, I mess it up, and the next morning it's just clean. Everything is back in its place. This is a magic table." And so the wife, she's just disgusted. She turns around and walks away. Well, the next day, his wife is still missing, and so he calls the police and says, "My wife has been missing. I don't know what to do." So 2 police officers come to his home. And he starts explaining that his wife has been missing, and they say to him, "Well, what's the last time you spoke to her?" So he brings them to the laundry room and explains the conversation that they had. One of the police officers, a female, says, "Are you joking? That's ridiculous." And she says, "No, it's true." And then he showed them the table over which they had the conversation as well, that this is a magic table. And so this woman, police officer, just disgusted, is about to walk away. But her partner, who's a male police officer, looks at the table, looks at the man, looks at his partner, and with a serious face says, "No, I believe him. I believe him. I have a table just like it at home." The illustration is that even though we don't see God at work at all times, God can be working despite the mechanism that you may think or not think of how he created it. The whole point of Genesis is not exactly how God created the world, but that he created the world. The whole point is not the physical composition of us human beings, but our relationship with this Creator God and our relationship with each other and with this planet that he's put us on. That's the point of these chapters in Genesis. And we can talk about inspiration and authority, but those are the key messages of those early parts of Genesis. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about in regards to Genesis 1 to 11 is the relationship of chapters 1 to 11 with chapters 12 to 50. One of our textbooks stresses the integration of these two parts of Genesis. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about now. I've stressed the uniqueness of chapters 1 to 11 from 12 to 50, and that is true. But we also have to talk about how they're integrated, intertwined together, because there is no separation from chapter 11 to chapter 12. It's a seamless transition in the story from chapter 11 through to chapter 12 and on through to the rest of the Bible, because there are important themes that arise from chapters 1 to 11 that get mentioned in chapters 12 to 50, are focused upon, and then, in fact, in the rest of Scripture. Even though it's quite different from Genesis, it's also seamlessly tied together. Now, as I mentioned, the center of gravity of Genesis is in that second part, chapters 12 to 50, just by sheer length of the books that we have there, the chapters that we have there. This focus on the family of Abraham and his descendants. But this focus of the story on Abraham and his descendants are set within the context of the cosmos. So Abraham's story is set within the larger context of world history. And it's that world history and that cosmological understanding that later on the Old Testament will return to, and especially the New Testament returns to. And even Revelation will pick up these themes at the very end of the Bible and tie them back up. So it's one grand story that is all intricately interconnected. Think of it a little bit like this. If Genesis were a novel, here's one of my favorite novels, The Lord of the Rings, then chapters 12 to 50 would be like The Lord of the Rings, and 1 to 11 would be like The Hobbit. It's really the same story, and these themes are picked up again and come up again and again. But that's what we're going to look at right now. What are a couple of these themes? So the first one I'd like to talk about is sin, as was read out to us by Matt earlier this morning. There's this focus on sin in these chapters, from chapters 3 onwards to 11. But what is sin? Well, the word sin actually is not used in the third chapter of Genesis. Instead, what's described is a situation. God plants a garden, creates Adam and Eve, and gives them a role to take care of the garden with some very clear boundaries around what they are not to do. And that is to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, is that tree simply a physical tree, and that rule, that boundary, simply a physical rule, a literal rule that they are to keep? I think it's more than just a literal physical rule and tree. In his creation, who has knowledge of good and evil? Is it not God who created the world and called it good in that first creation account in chapter 1? He called it very good, in fact, after the creation of humankind. Is not God the one who knows, who can discern what is good and evil? See, this grasping after the fruit of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not simply a physical boundary that had been crossed, but it was more of a spiritual boundary, that they would discern for themselves what is good and evil, rather than relying on what God had told them is good and evil. Remember their purpose for which God had created them. They were to rule this world. They were to be his representatives, kings and queens on this earth, but not an autonomous kind of a rule, right? He is sovereign over all things, and they would be his kings and queens, his representatives. But that means that they need to be in connection with his rule. But that temptation then to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not simply a physical boundary as much as it is a spiritual one. That they would discern for themselves. They would discern their rule apart from God's rule. That's how I read it. That they would take this knowledge for themselves and they would think that they can decide for themselves apart from God's wisdom, apart from relationship with God, what is good and what is evil. So it's, above all, a symbolic kind of a transgression, a spiritual transgression. And notice what happens once that transgression happens. Once that fruit is taken from the tree and is eaten, there's a curse that's placed on the serpent, there's a curse that's placed on the land, and the beautiful harmony that once was between the man and the woman and their relationship with each other and with the land is suddenly broken. There's this rift that happens between the man and the woman. And notice what it says in Genesis 3:16. Your desire, the Lord is speaking to the woman, shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. They were supposed to rule this world together, but now he will rule over her. There is this contrary desire against him. And then we flip over to chapter 4. The Lord says to Cain, in the next generation, whose offering is not acceptable to the Lord, he says, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire, the word again that was same in chapter 3, is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. That is sin. But he is not able to overcome sin, to rule over sin. And instead what we see is jealousy and then murder. And so we see that although men and women were originally intended for God's right rule, his good rule, his proper rule over creation as his representatives, what happens is there's this desire for self-governance, and eventually this rule gets distorted, and eventually it becomes sin that rules over this world. And that becomes a dominant theme, or one of the dominant themes in these chapters, this downward spiral of this rebellion of humanity. And the text we read this morning from chapter 6 represents the lowest point of that narrative. And really, it is so tragic the way that the narrator has described it. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth. It grieved him to his heart. Do you remember what the words were in Genesis 1? The Lord blessed the man and woman. The Lord blessed creation and called it good, called it very good. And here at chapter 6, the Lord looks on the mess of creation that he had made, but has been transgressed, and he regrets making it. He regrets creating mankind along with creation. Deep sorrow. That's not the way it was intended to be. The way the textbook describes this is divine will versus human responsibility. Divine will versus human responsibility. That is, this is what God intended, but this is how human beings misappropriated God's intentions and distorted it. Now, there's a second theme that I want to talk about because it's not all dark in these early chapters of Genesis. There's this undercurrent of something deeper that is going on in the story. It appears at multiple points in this story, and I just want to show you two examples of it. The first is in the garden, in that curse that God places upon the serpent, he makes this pronouncement upon the life of the serpent or the fate of the serpent. He says, I will put enmity, that I'll put some kind of strife between you and the woman and between your offspring and her offspring. And then there's this mysterious saying, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. He shall bruise your head. The offspring of the woman will bruise your head, and you, the serpent, shall bruise his heel. See, the story of the serpent is not finished, even though this story here is finished. The story of God's interaction with mankind and the serpent is not finished, and it will pick up again. This is what theologians call the proto-gospel, the first instance, first version of the gospel. It'll look forward to a time when Jesus encounters sin, and Jesus overcomes sin. And even though sin made its mark on him, crucified him, he overcame sin. He resurrected, and he eventually vanquished and conquered over sin. He had the ultimate victory over the serpent. Another example is how God deals with Noah. And this is called in the textual, in textual scholarly lingo, it's called a palistrophe, where there's this kind of a chiasm structure. And at the very center of that chiastic structure, because there's this symmetry, this mirroring that's going on from chapter 6 all the way to chapter 19. At the very center of the story is chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah and all the animals that were in the ark. The point is that despite the rebellion, despite the mess that was going on, and the judgment that then ensued, despite all that, God has compassion. God has mercy. And it's God's mercy that prevails and moves the story forwards. Of course, we know that story continues in Israel. And that story continues in Jesus as the climax of that story, as the one who ultimately rules over sin, and is the one who is vanquished over sin. And he's the only one who can. Okay, that brings me to my final point, which is let's talk about how it's relevant today. Because the point of all of this is not simply as an academic exercise to be able to recognize the sin out there, the brokenness of the world out there. I think we can all do that. We can all recognize the brokenness of the world out there. Ultimately, the point of these chapters is to be able to read them and use them as a mirror and see that the sin is not just out there, the brokenness is not just out there, but it's a reflection of my own heart as well. It's a reflection of who I am, who I tend to be as well outside of God's grace. It's a reflection of our own rebelliousness, our own sinfulness, our own self-centeredness. It's our reflection of our own need to be rescued from that state. It's like that praise song, Lord, I need you, how I need you, every hour I need you. This constant dependence on him. That's the point of these chapters, personally for us, spiritually for us. I want to close with one more story. It's a story of Dennis Lamoureux. And this is the professor that I met at Regent College in my first year studying there, who helped me understand the relationship between faith and science. He shared with us his story, how he came to faith and how he eventually was called to ministry and how he was called to professorship at Regent College. He grew up in a Catholic home and had what he considers very real spiritual experiences growing up. But as he grew, his faith did not mature. And when he started attending university, he became enamored with science, in particular, evolutionary science in biology. And in his worldview at that time, science and the Bible simply could not be held together. If evolution was true, then the Bible was false. And so he moved from this place of agnosticism eventually to atheism. But more than just an intellectual movement, there's this spiritual and moral movement in his life, a behavioral one. because he said to himself, if evolution is true, and if the Bible is false, and if simply the concept of the survival of the strongest is the kind of underlying principle of life, well, then I'm just going to live my life like that. And he did, in a very hedonistic way, very self-centered kind of way, as a university student, thinking really only about himself and having a good time. He partied a lot, he drank a lot. You can imagine his relationship with women, what kind of relationships those were. And there was a part of him, even despite that lifestyle, that kind of rose up from time to time, but he consistently ignored it and suppressed it. And this is what he writes in this part of his biography there in that book. Though my heart was hardening and getting darker, there was a still small voice telling me that what I was doing was wrong. Yet this sense of guilt was rationalized away with a dysteleological, that means without purpose or without meaning, a dysteleological interpretation of psychology and evolution. I wrote off the voice inside me as simply conditioning from my Roman Catholic upbringing, and I often repeated a mantra that I had concocted. Psychological baggage of Catholicism, you're nothing but an animal. Psychological baggage of Catholicism, you're nothing but an animal. Psychological baggage of Catholicism, you're nothing but an animal. Well, he graduated eventually, he was admitted to dental school, and then he joined the Canadian Army as a health officer and continued to lead a very secular, self-centered, hedonistic lifestyle in the Army. But he also joined a peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, and in a series of events on that island, he almost died from alcohol poisoning from drinking too much at a bar one night, and he had this encounter with a young hired woman that his colleagues, his army friends had hired for him, but he walked away from that. He writes about how that behavior just made him feel sick to the stomach. And that experience of almost dying made him reflect and contemplate. And he writes this. He writes this about that account. I became a Christian during the Cyprus tour through reading the Gospel of John. I cannot remember putting an old King James Version of the Bible in my pack when leaving Canada, nor do I recall exactly when or why I started reading Scripture. I just did. The grace of God and the mystery of a mother's prayers were undoubtedly factors. At the beginning of the tour, I distinctly remember feeling dirty. But as I embraced the message of Jesus in John's Gospel, I started to have a sense of cleansing. There were no visions, angels, or major crises in my life. I simply yearned for holiness. And as I read my Bible, I experienced filth being washed away from inside me. Dennis then writes about attending a Good Friday service there on Cyprus, with only half a dozen other military around him in that service. In the middle of the service, he suddenly realized Jesus died for his sins. And as the scriptures were read that morning, he started to weep and weep and weep. He couldn't stop weeping. He wept all the way as he walked back to his quarters. And that was the moment he realized who he was before God and who Jesus was for him. Now, that's just the beginning of his journey. I'm going to summarize the rest of it. He did this complete turnaround on his present life. And he felt this call to become a creation scientist because of the role that evolution had played in his past. He felt this call to become a creation scientist. And what that is theologians who use science to try to defend a 7-day creation understanding of the Bible. He thought that was a way to go. He would become a creation scientist. He would debunk theologians who would advocate for evolution, and then he would debunk scientists who tried to advocate for evolution. And so what he did, he left the army, he left his budding dental and medical career, and he enrolled at Regent College. He started studying a master's degree. He did a master's in the first chapters of Genesis. And then he realized that the biblical question was actually much more complex than he originally thought. He went on to do a PhD in theology at the University of Toronto in these first 11 chapters in Genesis, and he concluded that he couldn't, on the biblical data, he couldn't advocate for a 7-day creation based on the biblical data. But that didn't deter him. He still had this very strong calling in his heart. And so he thought he would enroll as a PhD student in biology, studying evolutionary biology, with the intention to be able to debunk evolution as a scientist. That was his kind of underlying goal, his hidden agenda. Well, he couldn't do that either. He realized at one point just the power as a scientific theory of the truth of evolution. And he came to accept that as part of his worldview. That journey took him 8 years of research at the highest levels of theology and science. But that journey towards the accepting of the truth of evolution did not take away from the basic fact of his salvation, the basic place of faith in Jesus in his heart and in his life. In fact, it helped him to strengthen his faith, if anything, to see God at work in the most meticulous details of the smallest organisms of life at all times, that God was so powerful. That was the same God who had a relationship with him and died for him, gave his life for him in Jesus. That was the same God who wanted to rule in his life, to be the Lord in his life, and wanted to give him purpose and meaning in life. That was the same God of science, was the same God of faith and the Bible. And that's what God wants to do for all of us. He wants to deal with that sin in our lives. He wants to deal with the sin in our lives because he didn't create us for that. And that sin in our lives represents something that is much, much less than what God's intention is for us. It's much less than what God has in store for us. And so he wants to deal with that sin in our lives so that we can live in a way that he's designed for us to be. He wants that for us, and he's provided a way for us to do that in Jesus.